Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky is more than 52,000 acres of dense forests, deep ravines, and endless underground labyrinths. It's a place where silence has its own weight, and the shadows of the trees are longer than life itself. On October 14, 2014, this silence swallowed up a man who knew the park like the back of his hand. An experienced ranger went on a routine patrol and simply disappeared into thin air. Hundreds of people, dog handlers, and helicopters searched for him, but the forest gave no trace. Everyone thought he was dead. But what was found 2 years later, deep in the cold earth, was more terrible than any death. This is not a story about disappearance. This is a story about what remains of a person when someone tries to break them, and about who is really hiding in the dark while we sleep. On October 14, 2014, a deceptive silence reigned in central Kentucky. Mammoth Cave National Park is 52,000 acres of dense forests, deep ravines, and endless underground labyrinths. This is a place where geology dictates its own strict rules. The world's longest cave system stretches underfoot, and the surface is covered with thousands of sinkholes that can swallow a person without a trace. It was here, among the majestic oaks and limestone cliffs, that a story began that for many years became a nightmare for the locals. For 40-year-old Ranger David Long, this day was supposed to be just another routine Tuesday. David was a 15-year veteran of the Park Service. He was described by his colleagues as a man of the cliff, a man of few words, a disciplined professional who knew every trail and stream in the area he was assigned. At 7 o'clock in the morning, as usual, he said goodbye to his wife Olena and 15-year-old daughter, got into his white Chevy Tahoe SUV, and set out on patrol. David's route was through the northern sector of the park, toward the Green River Ferry. His task was to check the Joppa Ridge area. In recent weeks, tourists and local farmers had reported suspicious activity in the area. Wheel tracks in off-limits areas and the sound of gunfire. Poaching has always been a problem in these forests, and David was determined to protect the reserve. The wheels of his SUV crunched on the gravel of the service road, kicking up a plume of dust. The autumn forest stood walled around him, hiding dangerous chasms behind its yellow leaves. At 14 hours and 30 minutes, David's calm voice interrupted the silence of the radio. According to the records of the dispatching service, this was his last contact. "Base, this is Long," the ranger said clearly. "I'm near the old thatch cemetery. I see an abandoned ATV in the bushes, 50 meters from the road. There are no license plates. The VIN code is worn off. It looks like someone tried to hide it. I'm going to check the tracks. They lead towards the sinkhole. Over and out." The dispatcher recorded the time and message in the log. It was a standard procedure that didn't raise any suspicions. No one could have imagined that these words would be the last the world would hear from David Long. The clock was slowly approaching 17 hours, 00 minutes, the time of the mandatory checkpoint call for all patrol officers ending their shifts. David's radio was silent. The dispatcher tried calling him at 17 hours 15 minutes, then again at 17 hours 45 minutes. The only response was the monotonous hiss of static voltage. The Mammoth Cave Park has a difficult terrain, and dead zones where the radio signal disappears are quite common, so there was no hurry to raise panic. However, when the sun began to set, casting long shadows on the trees, the concern turned into anxiety. At 18 hours and 30 minutes, David's partner, Mark Sloan, received orders to drive to Long's last known location. Mark drove his car along a winding dirt road, peering into the twilight. At 19 hours and 15 minutes, his headlights caught the familiar silhouette of a government-issued Chevy. The car was on the side of the road, not far from the mossy thatch cemetery. The engine was cold. Sloan walked up to the car, his hand on his holster. The doors were locked. Through the glass, he saw an absolutely mundane picture. On the passenger seat was an open map of the sector and an unfinished sandwich, neatly wrapped in foil. A bottle of water was lying next to it. Everything looked as if David had left for 1 minute and was about to return. There were no signs of a struggle around the car, no broken windows or traces of blood on the gravel. Only the silence of the evening forest. Already at 22 o'clock, the area of the Tetch Cemetery turned into the center of a large-scale search operation. Dozens of volunteers from the city of Bowling Green, county police, and rangers combed the woods with flashlights. Helicopters equipped with thermal imagers took to the skies, scanning every square inch of the area. Dog handlers brought in dogs, letting them sniff the seat of David's car. The dogs confidently picked up a trail that led from the car deep into the forest. They walked about 300 yards, winding through centuries-old trees, and suddenly stopped at the edge of a steep ravine. Then the trail broke off. The ravine was densely overgrown with kudzu, an aggressive vine that covered the ground in a continuous green carpet, hiding any holes or crevices. The dogs circled in place, whining, but refused to go down. It seemed that David Long had reached this point and simply vanished into thin air. The ATV he had reported on the radio was never found, neither in the bushes nor within a 2-mile radius. There were tire tracks on the grass, but they broke off on rocky ground where it was impossible to make out anything. The search operation lasted 7 days. Hundreds of people walked in a chain, turning over every log and looking into every crevice. The investigation's versions changed one after another, but none gave answers. Some detectives believed that the experienced ranger could have stumbled and fallen into one of the thousands of unknown sinkholes that permeate the area. Others whispered that he might have stumbled upon an illegal marijuana plantation being grown in the backcountry of the park and been removed as an unwanted witness. David's wife, Elena, and their daughter appeared on television, tearfully pleading with anyone with information to come forward. Their faces on the screen became a symbol of desperation. But the forest remained silent. A month passed, then another. Snow covered the tracks of the search teams. David Long's case was officially classified as cold. His service badge was put in a safe, and the investigation files were sent to the archive. No one knew that the answer to all the questions was much closer than they thought, and much more terrible than ordinary death. In the depths of the forest, where the light of the lanterns did not reach, someone was watching closely as hope faded. On November 12, 2016, exactly 2 years and 1 month after the ranger's disappearance, the Kentucky woods decided to reveal one of their worst secrets. The day was cloudy and damp, typical of late fall in Edmonson County. The events unfolded on private property in a dense wooded area west of the tiny village of Lincoln. It was a blind spot for official search teams, private property fenced off with rusty barbed wire and signs warning against shooting without warning. Yet it was these prohibitions that attracted a group of 3 amateur cavers looking for an adrenaline rush and unregistered entrances to underground systems. The group was moving along a dried-up creek bed when one of the explorers noticed an unnatural pile of debris at the foot of a limestone slope. It looked like an old dump. Half-rotted car tires, rusted barrels, and a pile of dry branches stacked too tightly to be an accident. Pulling off one of the heavy tires, the cavers felt a powerful stream of cold air coming out of the ground. It was a sure sign of a large cavity below. Under the layer of garbage was a narrow, barely visible hole that led vertically down into the black abyss. Using climbing equipment, the group began to descend. The mine, which they called the Devil's Throat, went down to a depth of about 30 meters. The walls of the well were slippery with moisture, and the air was becoming heavy and musty. When they reached the bottom, the flashlight beams snatched out of the darkness a narrow horizontal tunnel leading to a small natural grotto. But what they saw next made them stunned. The natural structure of the cave had been rudely interfered with by the human hand. The path was blocked by a massive rusty grate built right into the limestone rock. It looked like a medieval dungeon hidden in the depths of an American forest. There was someone behind the grate, in a stone niche no more than 2 by 2 meters in size. At first, the cavers thought they were seeing a corpse. The body was so still, lying on dirty rags. But when the beam of a powerful diode torch hit the figure's face, it stirred. It was David Long. But it was not the strong man from the photographs on the pillars. There was a shadow before them. His skin had turned pale, almost translucent, like that of cave fish that had never seen the sun. A network of veins was visible through the thin layer of epidermis. His body was extremely emaciated. His ribs stuck out so sharply that it seemed they were about to break through the skin. He was chained. A thick chain encircled his left ankle, cutting into the ulcerated flesh, and the other end of the chain went to a heavy metal anchor driven deep into the wall. Around him, in a chaotic mess, were plastic containers with the remains of moldy food and buckets filled with sewage. The smell in the grotto was unbearable, a mixture of ammonia, rot, and dampness. However, the worst thing was not the exhaustion or the dirt. The worst thing was the face. David Long was staring straight into the blinding light of the lanterns, his eyes wide open, unblinking. His pupils were dilated to the limit. And his lips were stretched in an unnaturally wide, crazy smile. It was not an emotion of joy or relief at being saved. It was a frozen grimace, a mechanical muscle spasm that did not leave his face for a second. He did not scream, cry, or ask for help. Only a quiet, vibrating sound, similar to the whimpering of a beaten dog, came from his throat. The cavers immediately went to the surface to catch a cell phone signal and call the rescue service. An hour later, the forest, which had remained silent for 2 years, was again filled with the sound of sirens. Rescuers had to use special equipment to get down into the mine and cut the lock. According to the reports of the officers who were first down there, David did not react to the sparks from the grinder that were falling at his feet. He just kept looking at the same spot and smiling that same eerie smile. The evacuation was difficult. The exhausted man was lifted to the surface with a winch. His eyes had to be covered with a bandage so that the daylight, which he had not seen for 25 months, would not burn his retina. An ambulance took him to TriStar Greenview Medical Center in Bowling Green amidst sirens. Doctors in the emergency room were shocked by the patient's condition. The medical report read like a chronicle of torture. He was diagnosed with critical muscle atrophy. The muscles of his legs were almost completely atrophied from lack of movement. The body was dehydrated to the point of kidney failure. But his hands raised even more questions. X-rays showed numerous healed fractures of the phalanges of the fingers on both hands. The bones fused incorrectly, forming ugly knots. Someone had been breaking his fingers, methodically and with timing, waiting for them to heal before breaking them again. David Long had returned from the world of the dead, but he had not returned fully. In the sterile intensive care unit, under drips and monitors, he continued to lie motionless, staring at the ceiling with an unblinking gaze and smiling into the void. The investigators understood one thing. Someone had spent a lot of time and effort to equip this cell. Someone had brought food regularly. Someone had gone down into that darkness not to kill, but to keep life in this body for some sick purpose. While doctors fought for David's physical survival, police surrounded the entrance to the cave with yellow tape. Forensic experts began collecting evidence in the dungeon. Among the garbage and dirt, one of the detectives found an object that made his blood run cold. It was a children's book with fairy tales, the pages of which were worn to holes, as if they had been flipped through thousands of times. Friends, before we continue to dive into this creepy story, I want to ask you about one important thing. YouTube's algorithms work in such a way that your activity is the only way other people will be able to see this video. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and write any comment you like. It will only take you a few seconds, but it will help us tell the truth that has been hidden for years. Thank you for your support. The hospital room at TriStar Greenview Medical Center was filled with the smell of antiseptics and the monotonous hum of life support equipment. To Detective Rebecca Holt of the Warren County Sheriff's Office, this sterile whiteness seemed more depressing than the dirt of the cave from which David had been pulled. Rebecca was a tough investigator who had seen the aftermath of accidents, shootings, and domestic violence. But what was in that hospital bed made her stomach churn. David Long was in what psychiatrists call a dissociative fugue. His body was here, warm and safe, but his mind was still wandering somewhere in the dark, damp tunnels underground. He didn't respond to his name, didn't recognize his wife, and didn't answer the investigator's questions. He simply stared at a single point on the wall, rocking back and forth slightly. Detective Holt tried to make contact. She sat down next to the bed, trying to speak quietly and calmly so as not to frighten the victim. But the interrogation was interrupted by an ordinary domestic scene that revealed the full horror of what had been happening to David for the past 2 years. A nurse entered the room with a tray on which was a bowl of broth and a glass of water. As soon as David heard the clinking of the dishes and smelled the food, his body reacted instantly, without waiting for a command from his brain. He straightened up sharply, turned his head toward the door, and smiled. It was the same grimace that the rescuers had seen in the cave. His lips stretched so wide that the skin on his cheekbones turned white, exposing his teeth and gums. His eyes remained completely empty, dead, full of animal horror. He held that smile while the nurse placed the tray on the table, and did not relax his facial muscles even when she left. The clinic's lead psychiatrist later explained to Detective Holt the nature of this reaction. It was not an emotion. It was a conditioned reflex developed through brutal, methodical training. It's a classic conditioning, like Pavlov's dogs, only they used food instead of a bell, the doctor stated dryly, looking at the observation notes. He's been broken for months. The scheme is simple and terrible. If you want to eat, smile. Show joy. If he did not smile, he was punished. The doctor pointed to another episode recorded by a surveillance camera in the ward. When an orderly accidentally slammed the door but did not bring food, David did not smile. Instead, he instantly pressed his head into his shoulders, closed his eyes, and covered his head with his hands, bracing himself for the impact. The conclusion was clear. The kidnapper was not just holding the ranger captive. He was destroying his personality, turning him into an obedient animal who had to feign happiness for the right to get a piece of bread. While the doctors tried to reach David's consciousness, the forensic experts continued to work at the crime scene. The cave, which the locals dubbed the Devil's Throat, was not just a natural shelter. It was a carefully prepared prison. An examination of the scene showed that the criminal had been preparing for the kidnapping long before that Tuesday in 2014. In the far corner of the grotto, hidden behind stones, experts found an old Honda gasoline generator. It was disconnected, and the fuel tank was empty, but the very fact that it was there indicated that they planned to provide light or electrical appliances. A crude ventilation system was also found. Plastic pipes brought to the surface through invisible cracks provided fresh air so that the prisoner did not suffocate, but could not get out either. The strangest discovery was a stack of books neatly stacked on a stone ledge. They were children's fairy tales, brightly colored, with large letters usually bought for preschoolers. They looked surreal among the dirt and excrement. Investigators assumed that David was forced to read them aloud. Perhaps it was part of the same psychological game to force a grown man, a veteran of the Park Service, to read fairy tales to his tormentor, like a child to a parent. It was in one of these books that the forensic team found their first serious clue. On the glossy page of the story of the Three Little Pigs, the expert found a clear thumbprint. It was partially smeared with a dark, oily substance that looked like technical grease for weapons or machinery. It couldn't have been David's. His hands were too clean from being in the dark all the time, and he had no access to lubricant. Someone had thumbed through the book with dirty hands before throwing it to the prisoner. In parallel with the work of the forensic experts, Detective Holt began to check the land where the cave was found. This stretch of forest on the Edmonson County border had been considered no man's land or abandoned for years. The cadastral records were confusing, but Rebecca was persistent. She pulled up the tax records and found that the formal owner of the property was a company called Bluegrass Holdings LLC. The name sounded solid, but the check showed that it was a classic one-day company. It had no office, no employees, and no real business activity. The only trace that connected this ghostly structure to the real world was the address for correspondence. All tax notices and land lease bills were sent to a single P.O. box at the Louisville post office. It was 100 miles away from the crime scene. Someone had been very careful to hide their ends in the water, using shell companies to own a piece of woods with a ready-made prison underground. Detective Holt realized that whoever had rented the box was the key to the solution. And that key was now lying in a file on her desk, waiting to be requested by the Postal Service. On November 15, 2016, the investigation moved from hospital wards and dirty caves to the dusty offices of the park administration. The archives of the Mammoth Cave National Park Authority were located in the semi-basement of an administrative building in the eponymous town of Mammoth Cave. It smelled of old paper and cheap coffee, and shelves of documents kept the history of every employee who had ever worn a ranger's uniform. Detective Rebecca Holt spent almost a day here, poring over volumes of personnel files, looking for a hint of who might have hated David Long so much. The victim's file looked impeccable, even too much so. Commendations for exemplary service, successful rescue operations, and no disciplinary actions. David was an ideal officer who lived for his job. But experience told Rebecca that every perfect facade has cracks. And she found such a crack in a file dated 2011, exactly 3 years before the kidnapping. These were the materials of an internal official investigation that would forever change the life of not only David, but also the man he considered his second father. This man's name was Arthur Cobb, although everyone in the park knew him as Archie. In 2010, Cobb was a living legend of the reserve. He was a senior ranger, a mentor to young people, a man who knew the forest better than the wild animals. It was Archie who took young David under his wing, taught him how to read tracks and navigate the complex system of ravines. However, the investigation documents painted a completely different portrait of this legend. According to internal security reports, Arthur Cobb led a double life. By day, he was a law enforcement officer, and at night, he turned into an organizer of an elite poaching business. He organized illegal safaris in the reserve for wealthy clients from big cities. Cobb personally escorted hunters into closed areas of the park, where they shot deer and wild turkeys in violation of all federal laws. It was a well-established, cynical business that brought him tens of thousands of dollars. It all ended when David Long accidentally stumbled upon one of these groups in the Joppa Ridge sector, the same sector where he would disappear 3 years later. David was faced with the most difficult choice of his life: to remain silent and cover for his mentor, or to do his duty. The interrogation reports show that Long chose the latter. His testimony was key. He gave the investigation a detailed log of Cobb's duties, which did not coincide with the patrol schedule, and pointed out the locations of weapons caches. For 60-year-old Arthur Cobb, that was the end. He was dishonorably discharged, deprived of his state pension and all the benefits he had counted on in his old age. The trial was a show trial, and although Cobb avoided actual prison time thanks to a plea deal, his reputation was destroyed and his life was ruined. The record of the court session includes a recording of the defendant's last words. Cobb was unrepentant. He looked in the direction of David Long and, according to the bailiff, whispered only one phrase: "You took my life from me, puppy. One day, I will take yours." This threat, made 5 years ago, now seemed like a sentence. Detective Holt immediately began checking Arthur Cobb's whereabouts. Official databases claimed that after the trial, the former ranger had sold his home in Kentucky and moved to sunny Florida to live out his days away from the judgment of his former colleagues. But modern technology told a different story. Rebecca made a billing request for Cobb's old cell phone number, which was still active. The results stunned the investigation. Arthur Cobb's phone had never registered on Florida networks in the past 2 years. Instead, his cell phone signal was regularly detected by cell towers in the immediate vicinity of the national park. The dots on the billing map clustered around the towns of Brownsville and Park City, which are the settlements bordering the reserve. The ghost from the past was not going anywhere. He was right there, circling his victim like a shark, waiting for the right moment. The puzzle began to take shape when the detective compared this data with information about the land plot where the cave prison was found. The Phantom Company, Bluegrass Holdings, in whose name the land was registered, had registration documents leading to a post office box in Louisville. When Holt looked up the archival records of the founders of this company, she found the name Mary Cobb Vance. This was Arthur Cobb's own sister, who died in 2012. Her inheritance, including this abandoned plot of woods, was administered by her only relative, her brother Arthur. The motive of revenge became obvious and undeniable. Cobb didn't just kidnap David. He put him in a stone sack on his land, turning the life of his former student into a hell that he controlled. He did not want to kill, but to break, humiliate, and turn the proud officer into an obedient creature, just as the system had turned him, Cobb, into an outcast. But there was one detail that haunted Rebecca. Arthur Cobb was 65 years old at the time of his abduction. He was a strong man, but age was taking its toll. Organizing such a crime required considerable physical strength. It was necessary to track down a young, trained ranger, neutralize him without a fight, think of an unfinished sandwich, drag his unconscious body through the thicket, lower him to a depth of 30 meters into a narrow mine, install heavy metal grates and a ventilation system. And then, for 2 years, he had to go down regularly with food and water. Could the pensioner have done all this on his own? Detective Holt looked at the photos from the scene again. The welds on the grate were fresh and professional. The installation of the generator required technical expertise. David's physical exhaustion indicated that he was not only being held, but controlled by force. The office fell silent. Rebecca realized that there was another player in this story. In the shadow of the old vigilante was someone younger, stronger, and perhaps even more dangerous. Someone who was helping to turn the crazy revenge plan into reality. And this someone was still at large. On November 16, 2016, the investigation into David Long took a sharp turn, moving from the dusty archives to the grim reality of the industrial outskirts of Glasgow, Kentucky. The team's investigators, analyzing the financial flows of Arthur Cobb's shell company, discovered suspicious regular payments for real estate in a depressed neighborhood lined with warehouses and hangars. The documents pointed to an old, half-abandoned hangar listed as a farm equipment repair shop under the name Black Oak Repair. The place looked like the perfect hideout for someone who wanted to stay under the radar. The industrial area on the outskirts of the city lived its own rhythm. The rumble of trucks, the grinding of metal, and the constant noise of machinery in the neighboring sawmills created the perfect sound disguise. The hangar itself was a gloomy structure made of corrugated metal, rusted in places, with plywood-boarded windows. A heavy chain hung on the gate, and the closed sign was covered with a layer of dirt, indicating that there were no legal customers. At 10:45 in the morning, armored vans of the seizure team drove up to the building without a sound. The operation was led by the state police SWAT team, as the suspect, a former ranger, could be armed and skilled in combat. Snipers surrounded the perimeter. A tense silence reigned, broken only by short commands from the team leader. After the door was broken down with a hydraulic ram, the assault team rushed in. "Clear! Clear! The room is empty!" the voices of the soldiers sounded. Arthur Cobb was not inside. However, what the police saw in the light of tactical flashlights made even experienced operatives feel a chill. The first floor of the hangar was filled with dismantled tractors and combines. The air was heavy with the smell of machine oil, diesel fuel, and old iron. But this technical area was only a facade. In the far corner, behind an improvised plasterboard partition, investigators found an office space that looked more like the sanctuary of a crazed stalker. The walls of the room were covered with photos. There were hundreds of pictures taken by professional optics from a long distance. David Long was depicted in all of them. The chronology of the photos covered the period 6 months before his abduction. David leaving the house. David buying coffee at a gas station. David talking to his daughter at school. David checking his equipment. Arthur Cobb didn't just plan revenge. He lived the life of his victim, studying his every move, every habit, every route. It was a documentation of a predator hunting its prey. Some photos were crossed out with a red marker. Others had timestamps and coordinates. But the real horror was hidden below. Under a heavy workbench in the center of the workshop, a hidden hatch, disguised as an inspection pit for machinery repair, was discovered. Going down a narrow concrete staircase, the detectives found themselves in a basement that was completely soundproofed. The walls and ceiling were covered with a thick layer of acoustic foam and old mattresses that absorbed any sound. Absolute, vacuum-like silence reigned here. In the center of the room was a heavy metal chair bolted to the concrete floor. On the chair sat a mannequin, a common plastic doll from a clothing store, dressed in an old park ranger uniform. The mannequin was tangled in chains and ropes. This was the training room, a place where Cobb practiced his restraint techniques and likely torture scenarios before applying them to a live person. On a small metal table next to the mannequin was a thick, black-covered notebook. It was an observation diary kept by Arthur Cobb. The handwriting was small, sharp, and meticulous. Each page was lined like a laboratory journal. The entries contained no emotion, only a dry statement of the facts of the experiment on the human psyche. Detective Holt, wearing latex gloves, carefully turned the pages. The entry, dated the 45th day after the abduction, read, Day 45. Subject continues to resist, refuses to eat, tries to chew on shackles. Aggression is high. The regime of complete darkness and sleep deprivation is applied. He must realize that his will is worthless here. As Rebecca flipped through the tapes, she saw the tone of the recordings change. From describing physical resistance to recording a psychological breakdown. The entry from the 112th day was underlined twice. Day 112. Progress is obvious. The subject began to smile on command. The reflex is being fixed. He received a double portion of water as a reward. He has to learn to be grateful for every crumb. He is no longer a ranger. He becomes what I make him. These lines finally revealed the motive of the criminal. Arthur Cobb did not want to kill David Long. Death would have been too easy. His goal was complete, total domination. He wanted to turn the man who had ruined his career into an obedient dog, a creature without a will of his own, wagging his tail and grinning for his master's handout. It was revenge not through the destruction of the body, but through the destruction of the soul. Cobb was proving to himself his superiority over the system that rejected him by creating his own system where he was a god. The forensic team continued to examine the premises, collecting DNA samples and fingerprints. Although Cobb himself was not in the hangar, everything indicated that the room had been used actively and recently. On the table was a cup of half-drunk coffee, with a film still forming on its surface. A poorly extinguished cigarette was smoking in the ashtray. The walkie-talkie on the Special Forces commander's shoulder came to life.
Out of perimeter. Report. Sir, we found tire tracks in the backyard. They're fresh. Deep ruts in the dirt. The vehicle left the property at high speed, probably less than 10 minutes before we arrived. Detective Holt ran outside. A cold wind hit her face. The footprints led toward a wooded area that turned into the dense forests of the county. Arthur Cobb didn't just run away. He knew they were coming. Someone had warned him, or his paranoia and experience as a ranger had worked better than any alarm. The monster disappeared into the darkness again, but now he knew that the hunt was on for him. And in this hunt, he was on his own territory. On November 17, 2016, Kentucky turned into a zone of total police control. After Arthur Cobb escaped from his workshop in Glasgow, a top-level interception plan was announced. Patrol cars blocked the main highways, and photos of the former ranger were broadcast on all local TV channels. However, as is often the case, the key to the solution was not on the roads, but in the sterile silence of the crime lab. Experts working with the physical evidence seized from the Black Oak hangar focused on the contents of an ashtray found on the table next to the torture diary. Analysis of the DNA extracted from saliva on the cheap cigarette butt yielded an unexpected result. The genetic profile did not belong to Arthur Cobb. The database showed a complete match with a person who had previously been prosecuted for petty theft and hooliganism. It was 25-year-old Jason Cobb, the wanted maniac's own nephew. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the capture team went to the suspect's place of work. Jason worked as a laborer at a large sawmill called Sawyer's Lumber, located near the town of Smith's Grove. It was a noisy, dusty place where the air smelled of fresh sawdust and diesel fuel, and the roar of huge band saws drowned out any outside sounds. The detention operation was lightning fast. When the black tactical vans blocked the exits from the sawmill, Jason was loading the boards into the back of a truck. When he saw the armed men in uniform, he did not try to resist or run away.
Witnesses, other sawmill workers, later said that he simply dropped the toolbox, raised his arms, and knelt down in the dirt, as if he had been waiting for this moment all his life. There was no anger in his eyes, only animal fear and a strange, almost painful relief. Jason Cobb's interrogation began at 16 hours and 15 minutes in the Warren County Sheriff's Office interrogation room. Detective Rebecca Holt, who was in charge of the case, knew that she was not dealing with an ideological sadist, but with a weak link that needed to be pressed. It didn't take her long to find the sore spots. As soon as Rebecca laid out the photos of an exhausted David Long from the hospital on the table, Jason broke down. He sobbed, covering his face with his hands, and began to speak. His testimony became the thread that unraveled the tangle of lies woven by his uncle. According to the transcript of the interrogation, Arthur Cobb had been working on his nephew for years, manipulating his mind. For Jason, who grew up without a father, Uncle Arthur was an unquestioned authority, a hero of the war against the system. Arthur convinced the boy that David Long was a corrupt agent who had set him up, destroyed their family, and deserved a people's trial. He said we'd just isolate him, Jason sobbed, smearing tears down his dirty face. My uncle said it would be a comfortable captivity, that we'd keep him there until he confessed to his crimes and then release him. I believed him. I thought we were restoring justice.
Jason confessed to his role in the events of October 14, 2014. It was he who was the ghost on the ATV. He had purposely left the unmarked vehicle near the thatched cemetery, knowing that David Long, as the ranger in charge, would stop to check it out. Jason's task was to create a distraction, to lure David to the sinkhole where Arthur was waiting in ambush. But the scariest part of the confession concerned what happened later. Jason claimed that for the first few months he did not even go down into the cave. Arthur forbade him to do so, claiming that he was taking care of the prisoner himself. The truth was revealed to Jason by accident, 6 months after the kidnapping, when his uncle fell ill and ordered his nephew to take food to the prisoner. I went down there, thinking I would see a cell with a bed and a TV, like he promised. Jason's voice trembled with the horror of the memory. But I saw hell. It smelled like rot. David looked like a skeleton. He was chained to the wall like a dog. And when I shone the flashlight, he smiled. Jason described the same eerie, crazy smile that was the result of months of starvation torture. When the boy panicked and tried to confront his uncle, Arthur Cobb put a loaded gun to his head. He said I was an accomplice now, Jason whispered during interrogation. He said if I opened my mouth, I'd be in the next cell, and we'd be smiling together for the rest of our lives. I was afraid of him more than the police. I was afraid he would do the same to me. Detective Holt listened to this confession, realizing that time was running out. Arthur Cobb was on the loose, armed, and dangerous. She asked the main question: where could he be hiding now? Jason hesitated for only a second. He knew he was betraying the only person he cared about, but the fear of what his uncle had become was stronger. He has a place, an old hunting lodge, he said quietly. Deep in the woods, in the Daniel Boone National Forest, the Red River Gorge area. You can't get there by car, only on foot along old trails. He has been preparing this place for years, in case everything goes wrong. He has stockpiles of weapons, food, and a generator. He will not give up. He said they would not take him alive. This information immediately went viral. The coordinates Jason gave pointed to one of the wildest and most inaccessible areas of the state. It was an area of rocks, dense forests, and deep canyons where it was easy to hold the line and where every outsider became a target.
While the police escort was taking Jason, who was handcuffed, out of the interrogation room, SWAT teams were already gathering outside. The officers were checking their body armor and loading their assault rifles. They realized that they were not just going to detain him. They were going to war with a man who had turned a part of the forest into his personal horror grounds. And in this forest, they were already waiting for them. On November 18, 2016, the dawn over the Daniel Boone National Forest was cold and gray. The Red River Gorge area is a place of wild, primitive beauty, where sandstone cliffs rise above dense forests and deep ravines hide fog even at noon. It was here, at the top of an isolated rocky outcrop, reached by only one narrow, barely visible path, that Arthur Cobb's old hunting lodge was located. It was an ideal fortress, surrounded on three sides by a several hundred-foot deep chasm, and the only approach was from the windows of the cabin. The capture operation began at 5:30 in the morning. A combined team of Kentucky State Police SWAT team members and Federal Bureau of Investigation agents secured the perimeter. They had to move in complete silence, using the natural sound of the wind and the sound of the river below to hide the crunch of branches under their tactical boots. Snipers were lying in wait, keeping the windows of the hut in their sights. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every officer realized that they were going to capture a man with nothing to lose. At 6:10, when the group commander was preparing to give the order to assault, the situation changed dramatically. Specialists from the technical department monitoring the network intercepted the signal. Arthur Cobb was awake. He knew they were here. And instead of barricading himself in silence, he decided to turn his finale into a performance. Using a powerful satellite modem, he launched a live broadcast to the internet to one of the popular video hosting sites. An image appeared on the screens of the tablets in the command center. Cobb was sitting at a table in the center of the hut. Behind him were shelves filled with folders and boxes, the same research archive he had taken out of the studio. He looked calm, even peaceful. He was holding a cup of coffee in his hands and an assault rifle next to him. "I know you're watching," he said, looking directly into the camera lens. His voice sounded clear, without the slightest tremor. "You came here thinking you were going to save the world from a monster. But you are too late. My experiment is complete, and it has succeeded brilliantly." Cobb took a sip of his coffee and smiled. The same cold, calculating smile that had once mesmerized the young Rangers. "Do you think the justice system is about force? No, the power is the will. I proved it. I took away from you a proud, principled Ranger, a hero who believed in the law. And I gave you back a smiling idiot, an obedient animal wagging its tail for a piece of bread. Look at him in the hospital. This is the true face of your justice. It is helpless before real power." The commander of the assault group realized that he could not wait any longer. The psychopath was broadcasting his victory live, and every second of delay played into his hands. "Attack! All groups, assault!" came the call in the headphones. At the same moment, the forest exploded with noise. Stun grenades flew through the windows of the hut, blinding the interior with bright flashes. The door flew open under the impact of the battering ram. But Cobb was ready. He didn't look for cover. He simply raised his rifle and opened fire through the walls, guided by the sound of footsteps. The bullets pierced the wooden paneling, and one of the officers of the first assault team fell, grabbing his leg. The bullet went through his thigh, missing the plate of his body armor. Blood splattered the porch, but the group did not stop, dragging the wounded man to safety under the cover of the shields. Cobb, realizing that time was running out, threw away his rifle and grabbed a gasoline can at his feet. He began dousing the papers on the table and shelves behind him. These were records of years of surveillance, detailed torture diaries, evidence of his crimes. "It's all going to burn," he shouted, flicking a lighter. "History will burn with me." The fire broke out instantly, engulfing the pile of papers on the table. The flames licked the walls. At that moment, the sniper, who had taken up a position in a tree 200 meters away, received a clear order. Through the broken window, he could see Cobb's silhouette against the background of the fire. The shot sounded dry and short. The .300 caliber bullet hit Cobb in the right shoulder, shattering the joint and causing him to drop his lighter and fly back against the wall. Special forces burst in a second later. 2 soldiers knocked Cobb down, pinning him face first to the floor, while others put out the fire with fire extinguishers, saving priceless evidence. Smoke ate his eyes, the smell of gasoline mixed with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Arthur Cobb did not scream in pain, although his shoulder was turned into a bloody mess. When they handcuffed him, he did not resist. The arresting officer turned on his body camera to capture the suspect's face for the record. He jerked Cobb to his knees and turned him toward the lens. "Arthur Cobb, you are under arrest on suspicion of the kidnapping and torture of David Long," the officer shouted, trying to block out the noise of the fire and radio chatter. Cobb looked up. His face, illuminated by the flashing lights of tactical flashlights, showed no fear, pain, or anger. He looked directly into the dashcam lens. Slowly, as if in slow motion, the corners of his lips moved upward. It was not his usual cynical smile. He was copying. He perfectly, to the last detail, reproduced the same wide, crazed, mechanical grimace that the investigators had seen on David Long's face in the hospital. Cobb's eyes remained cold and empty, and his mouth was puckered in a horrifying parody of glee. "The lesson is over," he whispered with one lip, looking through the camera as if he could see his broken victim on the other side of the screen. The police dragged him out of the burning hut at gunpoint. The fire was extinguished, saving most of the archive. But what happened in those moments was captured by the camera. The maniac's victory was not that he escaped, but that he left his mark forever. And this imprint was now on the face of everyone who dared to look into his abyss. The operation was over, but the real horror for all the participants was just beginning, because the evil they had caught had already taken root and could not be torn out. May of 2017 brought to Kentucky not only the warmth of late spring, but also the final of the trial, which the local press dubbed the case of the century. The Warren County Courthouse was surrounded by a tight ring of reporters and television vans. The case of Ranger David Long's kidnapping went far beyond regional news to become a national symbol of how deep human cruelty can go. The courtroom was packed to capacity, but as the convoy brought the defendant in, the room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioners humming under the ceiling. Arthur Cobb, David's former mentor and torturer, sat in the dock with a stony expression. His right shoulder, shattered by a sniper's bullet during the assault, was secured in a medical brace, but it was the only sign of his vulnerability. He refused to have the last word, refused to admit guilt, and refused to look at the victim's family. His defense tried to play the insanity card, citing age-related mental changes and paranoia, but the prosecutor destroyed this strategy in one move. He simply laid out the diaries he had saved from the fire on the table. These records, which Arthur Cobb kept with the meticulousness of a sadistic scientist, became the main nail in the coffin of his defense. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. This was a record-short time for a case of this complexity, which testified to the absolute irrefutability of the evidence. The chairman of the jury, reading out the decision, could hardly contain the trembling in his voice. He was guilty on all counts: aggravated kidnapping, torture, infliction of grievous bodily harm, and attempted murder of a police officer during detention. The judge, a man with 30 years of experience who has seen hundreds of criminals, looked at Cobb with undisguised contempt as he read the sentence. "Your actions, Mr. Cobb, are beyond human understanding," he said in the silence of the courtroom. "You did not just steal a man's body, you tried to steal his soul." The sentence was harsh and final: life imprisonment without parole plus 150 years on top. This ensured that Arthur Cobb would die in the same concrete box to which he had condemned his victim, only with no chance of escape. Jason Cobb, the nephew and unwitting accomplice, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The court took into account his cooperation with the investigation and sincere remorse. But the fact remained that he knew about the hell in the cave and remained silent for 2 years. His tears during the announcement of the verdict did not evoke sympathy from the audience. However, the real ending of this story was not in the courtroom, but 100 miles away, within the walls of the Western State Hospital Psychiatric Clinic in Hopkinsville. This is a high-security facility for patients with severe mental disorders, a place where time flows very differently. It was here that David Long was kept. 6 months after his release, David's physical condition improved significantly. Doctors managed to restore his weight, and his muscles, atrophied from 2 years of immobility, began to work again thanks to intensive physiotherapy. The scars on his fingers healed, turning into white scars. On the outside, he was the same man his fellow Rangers remembered. But inside, he was an empty shell. That day, Olena Long came to visit her husband right after the court hearing. She wanted to tell him the news that the monster had been punished, that justice had been served, and that they could try to start over. She found David in the common lounge. He was sitting in an easy chair by a large window overlooking the hospital garden. Trees were blooming behind the glass, the wind swaying the branches, but David's gaze was glassy and still. He was looking through the landscape, focusing on something that only he could see. "David?" Olena called softly, sitting down in a chair next to him. The man turned his head slowly, like a rusted mechanism, in her direction. There was no recognition in his eyes, no spark of love, no pain, not even fear. Only the abyss. Olena had gotten used to it over the past months, but each time it broke her heart all over again. She began to tell him about the trial, about the verdict, about the fact that Cobb would never be free again. David listened to her without blinking, his face a completely indifferent mask. Realizing that words were not reaching the goal, Elena decided to try something simpler. She opened her bag. "I brought you something," she said, trying to make her voice sound cheerful. "Your favorite apples. Golden, remember?" She took out a large yellow apple and held it out to her husband. The second David saw the food, something terrible happened in the room. The atmosphere of calm instantly disappeared. David's body tensed, his back straightened like a string. His face, which had been dead and indifferent a second ago, instantly distorted. The muscles in his cheeks contracted in a violent spasm, his lips pulled apart, revealing his teeth. It was the same smile. Wide, mad, mechanical. It was not a reaction to his wife or to the news of his freedom. It was the reflex of a dog trained to smile for food. David's eyes remained full of horror and emptiness, but his mouth continued to smile as he reached out with a trembling hand for the apple. He could not control it. Arthur Cobb had spent 2 years sewing this code into his victim's subconscious, and even the best psychiatrists were powerless to erase the program. Elena dropped the apple on the floor and covered her face with her hands, unable to hold back her sobs. The apple rolled across the linoleum, but David continued to sit and smile into the void, waiting for a command that no one else would give. Arthur Cobb was sentenced to die in a concrete box, but sitting in his cell, he could celebrate victory. He had achieved his goal. He had killed David Long. The man sitting by the window in the clinic was just a living monument to his cruelty, an eternal reminder that the human psyche can be broken in ways that no court verdict can ever glue it back together. That smile became an echo in the darkness that will sound long after the names of the perpetrator and his victim are forgotten. The story is over. But for David Long, the horror will never end.